Welcome to the Procurement Universe from MRSC. The topic for today's discussion is the MRSC Rosters Program. So joining me today is Rosters Coordinator Maggie Dalzell. We're going to discuss the common questions regarding business eligibility requirements within this program from our customer perspective. So one of the things that I realized by looking at your employee biography here at MRSC is this month is your 1-year anniversary. So congratulations, Maggie.
It is. Thank you.
So before we get started, though, I do want to take a step back because I think what's relevant to your background is this is our first podcast. And I think you have experience that really helps the production kickoff of this first event. You have a background in theater. So our icebreaker before we get into the details of the program is what was your favorite theater role that you've had?
My favorite theater role was Tweedledee in a production of Alice in Wonderland. So Tweedledee and Tweedledum, we had big pink overalls, ginormous pink overalls, and we stuffed them with a couple pillows, had one of those funny hats with the helicopter propellers on top, and really hammed it up. So it was just a lot of fun to play.
Great. Well, thank you for participating today to help us with this new production. So let's talk about the MRSC Rosters Program. So when we look at the Rosters Program, there's 3 different categories. You've got your small works roster, your vendor roster, and your consultant roster. So the first question around this program is, what does MRSC verify for vendors on the roster program?
Yeah, so we do verifications whenever businesses sign up and then annually upon their renewals. So let's take the small works roster first, just because that one requires a higher level of verification than the other 2 do. So for the small works roster, we verify that businesses have an active UBI number. If you do the type of work that requires a contractor's license, we make sure that you have an active contractor's license. If you have employees, we check that you have an open and active workers' comp account. We check that you are not debarred. And then we also check, there is a training that L&I does, a contractor's training that is required before bidding on public works projects. And that's been in place since July 1st, 2019. And some businesses are exempt from it, but if you're not, then we do check to make sure that you've completed the training. So when an agency runs a search for you, they'll see either that you've completed that training or that you are exempt from that training.
Got it. So as I understand it too, because those are construction projects, there's elements in RCW that are requiring that UBI number. So that's why you're making sure that's in place.
Yeah, correct.
Great. So that's where the distinction may fall within these vendor rosters then, right? Because if you're talking small works, that's the level of checks that you're doing before you're adding those vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'm correct, there's a difference then between the small works roster and then the vendor and consultant as far as your checks to get them on those rosters.
There are, yes. So the vendor roster and the consultant roster, we just check to make sure that you have an active UBI number. We don't do any of those other L&I checks. But that being said, we do have a fair number of businesses on both the consultant and the vendor roster who are actually out of state businesses. And in that case, we do give you the opportunity to just put your tax ID number in there. But we do encourage businesses to go ahead and get their UBI number squared away, because it will hold up your verification process, because we will reach out and we'll be like, hey, you put in a tax ID number. Is that because you're an out-of-state vendor, or was this an accident? Because we do want to make sure that your information is as correct as possible. So that's really the only element that we check in terms of the consultant and the vendor rosters.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
So as a customer, you'd want to see, is that UBI number in place, and then check with those vendors that you may be using, because many of our customers have that requirement for the business license in their own jurisdiction. So to be able to put those in place, those vendors on the roster would need to have a UBI to do that.
Yeah, so if you're planning to do work in Washington State and you're not actually Washington vendor, Washington business, it would be probably in your best interest to go ahead and get a UBI number set up anyway, even though we allow for a tax ID number to fill out your application.
Mhm. So that's just something as a customer, you would just maybe, you would check then compared to like with the small works, you know, for sure that UBI has been put into place because they've had to have all that in place to be registered as a contractor on the small works roster.
Yeah, just because those small works businesses have to have so many other requirements with L&I that we don't need for the vendor and the consultant roster.
Got it. So, you know, it sounds like then there might be a little bit of a delay sometimes when you look at going as a vendor that you're adding to the small works roster than compared to like the vendor or the consultant roster, because there are so many more requirements to get them onto the small works roster.
Yeah, and most of the time the delay is actually that L&I training, which if you've been on the roster for a little while, you maybe got an email from us saying, hey, you need to complete that training. But because it is a requirement for public works projects, we're actually not verifying businesses and getting them active on the roster, even if it's a renewal, until they've completed that training or they're exempt from that training. So we do know that that holds folks up, but it's one of L&I's requirements. And we are trying to meet those minimum requirements on behalf of the public agencies so that they know when they go to their rosters that the businesses that they're pulling up are qualified, verified to work in Washington state.
Right. So I'm going to guess one of the scenarios you may encounter then is you're an agency customer, you've got a business that's interested in doing a construction project. So they've directed them to join the MRSC rosters. And so sometimes if that agency customer's going then to the roster to find that business, it may not be right away because you're going through all those checks to get them onto that small works roster compared to where they'd be on the vendor and consultant roster, maybe a little bit quicker.
Yep. Unfortunately, that's the case. So again, we do have our eligibility requirements listed on our website. If you go to mrscrosters.org and you hover above, it says businesses up at the top. There'll be a drop-down menu and there's a link that says before you apply, and actually right on our homepage, it'll link to our eligibility requirements. So if you're thinking about joining, I highly recommend checking that out, making sure you have all your ducks in a row, completed that training if it's a small works roster.
Got it. And if I understand correctly too, from your rosters program, you've got a link to where the vendors can set up their UBI number to be ready to do business as well.
We do have a link to the Department of Revenue with some more information about the UBI number so that you can go ahead and get that taken care of if you're an out-of-state vendor and you don't have one yet.
Right. So it's easily accessed even as an agency customer. You could go to that roster site and pull that information and forward it to a vendor to help them get ready to be on the rosters.
Definitely. Yeah. And I'm always happy to send folks links and stuff too. So you can always reach out to me.
Great. Well, thanks for taking the time, Maggie, to talk through the process a little bit further, because I know sometimes in webinars, this is just an element and it's good to pull this one out individually and talk through what that really looks like.
Of course. Thanks, Josh, for asking. I know that, you know, the different eligibility requirements, verifications, bureaucracy can be confusing and can be slow. So we do our best to move things along as quickly as possible. But, you know, it's always great for the businesses to be as prepared as they can be so that we can get them on and get them active and hopefully get them some job opportunities.
Great. Well, thanks, Maggie, for sharing your perspectives on this.
Definitely.
All right. This ends our session. So everyone, thanks for taking the time in your day to join us. Until next time, enjoy your adventures in the procurement universe.